My name is John, and I've always lived for the hunt. For as long as I can remember, every autumn morning I waited with anticipation, excited at the thought of hitching up my dog Bella to my pickup, grabbing my rifle, and driving far away from the noise of the city. Bella is a German short-haired pointer, smart and obedient down to the smallest detail. We've been inseparable ever since she was a puppy, barely able to run after me through the fields. She's learned to keenly sniff out quail, grouse, partridges. In short, any game I've come to rely on for my own sustenance. I see no point in store-bought meat when true, adrenaline-filled life begins in the woods. My essential tool is my hunting rifle, and my pride is the marksmanship I've honed over the years. While I was living in Oregon, I was completely content with the local wilderness, the great misty forests, mountains with roaring rivers, and an abundance of wildlife. But several months ago, I decided to move to Maine, famous for its enormous, nearly untouched forests and vast hunting grounds. I'd always wanted to test myself in a harsher climate. Here on the cold eastern seaboard, winter arrives abruptly and lingers. Each hunting season is a brief but intense period when nature shows who truly reigns. I settled in a small cabin near a town that most people only passed through, rarely stopping for long. Most of the locals didn't mind my hobby. After all, their fathers and grandfathers were hunters or fishermen themselves. Feeling their approval and interest, I quickly made myself at home. All around were endless expanses cloaked in pine groves and river valleys shrouded in morning mists. The Atlantic wind brought a biting cold, and the snow, falling about once a week, wouldn't melt until early spring. Hunting here is a real test. Any mistake can be fatal because deep in the woods there are no stores, gas stations, or hospitals. You must be completely prepared, carrying extra ammunition, food, and above all, a cool head. At first I was overwhelmed by the unfamiliar territory, but I soon grew accustomed to it. I loved venturing far into the backcountry, where the roar of engines and the sight of other people were nowhere to be found. There, among towering evergreens, I felt an absolute freedom. As if the whole world had paused, leaving me alone with endless branches, the aroma of wild grasses, and the whisper of the wind. The autumn-winter hunting season was nearing its end. Birds had become scarce. Pheasants, capercaillies, and grouse were few and far between, and quails had all but disappeared to warmer climes. Only a couple of weeks remained before any outings were prohibited, and I wanted to try my luck one last time before the cold became unbearable. I got up at dawn, spread my ammunition out on the table, and meticulously checked my rifle. My pickup, which had seen hundreds of roads, was ready to stand guard and take me to the ends of the earth. I secured my ammo pouch to my hunting belt, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and stuffed a couple of sandwiches into my backpack. Bella sat by the door, as if eagerly anticipating the trip, her intelligent eyes following my every move. We left before sunrise, determined to reach the depths of the forest as early as possible. Though the calendar read late autumn, snowy patches were already everywhere, and the biting wind etched frost onto the windows. I thought that today I might bag a few more pheasants and maybe even a couple of grouse. But more than that, I simply wanted to immerse myself in the wild, to feel that familiar thrill as my heart raced with every sound. I expected nothing out of the ordinary, and I certainly had no inkling that my final outing of the season would turn into the most terrifying memory of my life. I arrived at the spot at dawn, when a feeble twilight was just beginning to pierce through the thick canopy of spruce branches. I'd chosen this place from a map, a remote, hardly trodden area mentioned only by experienced trackers. I parked the pickup along a narrow, unpaved road and immediately felt a penetrating chill. The air was utterly still. Only a few stray snowflakes swirled and landed on my jacket and on Bella's fur. We headed toward the dense forest, following a barely visible trail that wound its way through short pines and gradually deepened into the thicket. With each step, an unsettling silence pressed in on me. In other places, I was accustomed to the morning chatter of birds or the rustling of squirrels scurrying along brittle branches in search of food. Here, there was nothing but silence. The crisp frost underfoot crackled, and that solitary sound seemed to be the only noise in the entire world. A thought flashed through my mind that this place was far gloomier than I had expected, as if nature herself had paused in anticipation of something ominous. I told myself it was simply because we were so far from civilization and that the game here might behave differently, more cautiously. Bella usually bounded ahead, eagerly sniffing out every scent that might hint at recent animal activity. But today, she suddenly became cautious and sluggish. At first, I noticed her tail, normally perky and cheerful, hung limply, and soon she even pressed herself against me, as if trying to warn me of danger. I bent down to pat her head, feeling the hairs along her neck stand on end. It was as if a primal fear had seized her. I tried to reassure her. Though we never exchanged words, I felt our unspoken bond. Yet despite my attempts at confidence, my heart clenched. Bella had never behaved this way, not even when encountering bears or wild boars. As we continued, I noticed tracks in the snow. They resembled those of a wolf, but were noticeably larger than normal. The edges of the prints were a bit worn, as if they had been made late at night or early the previous day. The heel of the paw, even what one might call a heel, had a strange shape, slightly shifted forward, almost suggesting the outline of a human foot. I tried to explain it away as a mere inaccuracy caused by melting and refreezing snow. Yet a nagging doubt lingered. Suddenly, old tales of mythical creatures, beings that sometimes move on 4 legs and at other times on 2, flashed through my mind. I had always dismissed such stories as nonsense, but the combination of Bella's unsettling behavior and the oppressive silence forced me to wonder. We pressed further into the forest, and the tension grew almost palpable. Gradually, the feeling crept in that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I sensed as if unseen eyes were watching me. I didn't hear the snap of breaking branches or the crunch of snow, only an elusive warning of impending danger. Bella repeatedly stopped, froze, pinning her ears back, and softly whining. I gripped my rifle tighter, striving to calm my racing heart. Reaching a gentle hill, I glanced back for a moment. The musty twilight between the trunks remained as empty as ever, showing no signs of life. Then suddenly, somewhere at the edge of hearing, a muffled howl broke the silence. It lasted only a moment and then abruptly ceased, as if someone had deliberately not wanted to draw attention. The sound resembled a wolf's howl, yet it was too low and oddly human to be natural. I shuddered, for I'd never heard anything like it in all my years of hunting. Bella froze, her tail tucked between her legs, her eyes filled with fear. In that moment, I realized for the first time that one must tread extremely cautiously in these woods. More than anything, I feared the unknown, feeling its icy breath encircle me. Bella and I continued along our path, gradually descending into a forest hollow where a stream had once flowed. Now it lay encased in clear ice, resembling a glittering ribbon laid among looming boulders. Bella stayed right by my side, as if refusing to venture further ahead to scout for game on her own. I thought perhaps I'd find pheasants in the brush along the stream's edge or spot grouse nests in open clearings. But all remained lifeless. The deeper I descended into the ravine, the heavier the oppressive emptiness felt. On the steep slopes, tall firs grew, forming walls through which only a faint morning glow filtered. This place seemed to exist on the border of the familiar world. Bella kept glancing back, as if checking that we weren't being followed. I, too, felt that same primal fear even as I tried to maintain my composure. Then we rounded a bend in the stream's course and suddenly came upon a moose. It was an adult male, a massive creature that usually intimidates me merely by its presence if one gets within a few dozen yards. But this time, things were not as they should be. The moose didn't run. It didn't snort or display any aggression. It was as if it were sitting on the back half of its body, stuck in a strange, contorted position. Its eyes were half closed, and thick vapor mixed with saliva emerged from its mouth and nostrils. I immediately realized something was terribly wrong with the animal. It looked sick, as if tormented by a high fever or injury. Yet there was no blood, only a nauseating dampness and frost-covered fur on its chest. My hunting instincts warned me that a wounded moose could be unpredictable. I slowly raised my rifle, keeping my finger well off the trigger, simply ready. Bella snarled, which was startling because she'd never acted so aggressively toward large game. We usually steered clear of moose, since I rarely hunted them, preferring deer instead. Nevertheless, she growled loudly, almost clawing at the ground, while simultaneously hesitating to approach. I noticed the moose twitching spasmodically as if every bone trembled under an unknown fever. I tried to piece together what had happened. Had wolves or lynxes attacked it? Perhaps it had encountered a bear, been gravely injured, and wandered here to die. Yet there were no signs of predators nearby. Only on the side of the moose did I see deep, strange scratches, long and elongated, as if left by a wolf's claws, yet too large to belong to any creature I knew. I took a cautious step forward to get a better look. A moment later, our eyes met. The moose's eyes were shrouded in a murky film, but they held something unnervingly sentient. I'd never seen such a human expression in an animal before. It was as if the creature was trying to speak. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could hear its rhythm in my ears. Bella almost went berserk, tugging on her leash and barking like she was possessed. A wave of panic washed over me with every passing second. In the next moments, I became aware that although the forest remained eerily silent, a barely audible sound, a trembling moan, emanated from the moose. Suddenly, I felt a heavy pressure in my temples, a dull, oppressive force as if something were trying to invade my mind, instilling fear. I wanted to drop my rifle and run immediately, yet I couldn't move, as if I were paralyzed. My chest tightened with an indescribable terror. Then the moose lifted its head and its eyes locked with mine. I swear, for just a moment I saw in them a foreign, almost intelligent gleam. With each passing second, my horror intensified and my body refused to obey. Before me sat this colossal, essentially helpless animal, not roaring or groaning like a typical wounded moose, but staring at me with dead, unblinking eyes that seemed to extract my darkest fears. The pressure in my temples grew almost unbearable. I could literally hear my heart pounding. Bella alternated between yelping and whimpering, torn between the urge to flee and the instinct to protect me. I knew I had to retreat, yet my legs wouldn't respond. On some subconscious level, a fear signal had been triggered that kept me rooted in place. My body was paralyzed, my eyes locked with those of the creature. And then I heard it. a sound resembling a moan. The moose slightly opened its mouth, and from its throat emerged something akin to a whisper, indistinct yet eerily similar to speech. I couldn't discern any words, but it felt as if that whisper was shattering my mind from the inside. I hoped it was nothing more than a trick of my imagination. But those sounds repeated again, as if the moose were trying to squeeze out a lament or warning directed solely at me. Gasping in panic, I closed my eyes, desperate to shake off the alien presence invading my mind. In a brief moment of clarity, I managed to tear my gaze away and take a deep breath. Instantly, Bella clamped her teeth onto the edge of my backpack, as if trying to help break the hypnotic hold. Summoning every ounce of will, I attempted to circle around the moose, avoiding its gaze. But the moment our eyes met again, a powerful surge of terror overwhelmed me. I felt an intense urge to turn and run without looking back, yet something held me in place. Whether it was stubborn curiosity or the remnants of a hunter's self-control that insisted on assessing the situation to the end, the eerie moan of the moose shifted into a low, hoarse sound, and in it I distinctly heard what seemed to be a wolf's howl, a short, sharp, almost bestial roar emanating from the throat of this hoofed creature. I couldn't understand how it was possible. It was as if another entity, one that didn't belong to the moose, had spoken through it. I recalled the strange paw prints I had seen that morning, and that fleeting feeling of having heard something like a wolf's cry. But not quite a wolf. Could it be some kind of affliction forcing animals to merge into something else? Or was it an unknown force infiltrating their minds? I couldn't rationally explain what was happening. My mind insisted that it was all just a hallucination brought on by stress and the cold, but every nerve in my body screamed that reality was far more terrifying. I stepped one more pace forward and my heart exploded like a gunshot. The moose was riddled with scratches and bite marks. Beneath its layer of frozen fur, deep wounds were visible, as if left by a wolf or something similar. But the nature of these injuries suggested distortion rather than a simple animal fight. The moose lifted its head further, and through its groaning came a clear, unmistakable note of a wolf's howl. A deep echo rippled through the hollow, striking my head with a jolt of searing pain. Bella panicked, nearly in tears, and I realized then that I must not engage with this monstrous phenomenon. I had to get out of there immediately. Yet an unseen force, like a viscous hand, held me in place. I felt as if an alien consciousness were trying to latch onto my mind, burrowing in to strip away my will. In that moment, I felt as if I were teetering on the brink of madness, where one wrong move would condemn me to a life I'd never reclaim. Clenching my teeth, I waited for Bella to muster the strength to pull me out of this nightmare. In the next instant, the moose lifted its head and let out an unnatural, almost metallic scream, part howl, part ear-splitting scrape of wind. The sound hit me like a shockwave. I staggered, my hands trembling, and my brain vibrated as if in a relentless assault. Bella tensed and suddenly lunged for the strap of my backpack, jolting me out of my stupor. That sudden motion reminded me of who I was and that I had no right to succumb to fear. Instinct for survival flared, the one force that could overpower terror. Gripping my rifle tighter, I jerked backward. The moose made no move to chase me, although its eyes continued to haunt me with their nightmarish stare. I wasn't about to find out what might happen if I lingered. As soon as the paralysis began to lift, I turned and leapt toward the ravine's slope, taking Bella along with me. The sound emanating from the moose lingered for several more seconds, gradually transforming into a piercing shriek that seemed to claw at my eardrums and split my head with pain. I scrambled up the steep incline, clutching at frozen branches and roots. Stones slipped underfoot, striking my shins, but I paid them no mind. My only goal was to escape that cursed hollow and put as much distance between myself and that nightmare as possible. My legs trembled and I stumbled repeatedly. Bella stayed close, her ears pressed to her head as she whimpered, yet she remained vigilant. Every time I glanced back, I swore I heard the echo of that scream drifting from the ravine's shadows. Whether it was the moose or something else, I didn't know and didn't want to know. Finally, we emerged onto a flatter stretch where young pines grew. Here, the wind was stronger, its sharp gusts whipping my face as if to jolt me back to reality. I heard no footsteps in pursuit, no sounds of a chase. But in my head, the echo of that unexplainable sound still reverberated. A sort of energetic imprint left by that unfathomable creature. I fought to steady my trembling hands so I wouldn't lose my sense of direction. Recalling my map, I plotted a course back to my pickup. I had to head east where the sun rises. After checking the compass on my wristwatch, I quickened my pace. We trudged along without really paying attention to the path, tramping through shallow snow, leaping over fallen logs, and forcing our way through tangled underbrush. Both of us gasped from exhaustion and fear. Occasionally, I caught the sound of rustling branches, but I dared not investigate whether someone, or something, was following us. The mere thought that we were moving farther away from that cursed ravine was enough. After about a half hour of grueling pace, I heard the familiar voice of reason whisper in my mind, "Stop. Catch your breath, it's all behind you." Yet my subconscious screamed that in this forest, you can't afford to let your guard down for even a second. When we finally reached the car, the sun was already high on the horizon, though it brought no warmth. I collapsed into the cab of my pickup, feeling spasms in my legs and an unsettling shiver coursing through my body. I set my rifle on the seat without a second thought as to where it belonged. Bella jumped in after me, and I slammed the door as if it could shield me from the terrors of the forest. I turned the key in the ignition and floored it, not permitting myself even a moment's hesitation. The wheels spun on the compacted snow, but after a few jolts, the vehicle finally broke free. Inside my head, a storm of thoughts raged. I kept trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. Again and again, I recalled the moose's gaze, its inhuman moans, that flash of a wolf's howl. Even as I drove, almost on autopilot, my pulse remained sky-high. The road was rough and winding between clusters of trees. I risked careening into a ditch, but couldn't slow down. The only thought in my mind was, get as far away from this place as possible. I felt that if I lingered, I too would become a victim. Someone over whom an unknown force would assert complete control. Eventually, after reaching a broader country road, I turned toward the highway. Bella trembled in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with terror. I had never seen such raw panic in her gaze before. We sped over potholes, the car bouncing wildly, but I only pressed forward until we reached a solid paved road. Only then, feeling the steady hum of the engine on the smooth highway, did I realize that something unexplainable had occurred, that I was dangerously close to losing all control. Returning home brought no relief. Instead, a sticky, paralyzing fear had taken root deep within my subconscious. Every time I closed my eyes, horrifying images flooded my mind. That moose sitting there with its body marred by scratches, those emotionless yet unnervingly intelligent eyes, its inhuman moans. When I tried to sleep, these images piled up into a relentless kaleidoscope of terror. And Bella, who usually slept in the hallway, refused to leave my side. She curled up on the mat by my bed, watching the door with her tail tucked, her ears constantly perking up as if she could still hear distant sounds from the night forest. Nightmares became my constant companion. I saw the moose again, its face contorting into human-like features, and from its mouth emerged fangs reminiscent of a wolf's. In sleep, a paralyzing tremor gripped my body, and I felt that same crushing pressure in my temples, the whisper that shattered my consciousness. Every morning, I woke in a cold sweat, overwhelmed by an uncontrollable urge to run away, desperate never to be alone in the silence of my own home. At first, I tried to rationalize what had happened, blame it on exhaustion, the cold, stress, or hallucinations. But Bella was living proof that my fear was real. She no longer behaved in her cheerful, carefree manner. She rarely wagged her tail and jumped at even the slightest noise. I analyzed whether I might have encountered a rabid moose, and that these strange events were nothing more than the product of a panic attack. But a rabid animal displays aggression, charges recklessly, while that moose simply sat there, draining the life from me with its gaze. Animals simply do not make such sounds. It defies every law of nature. Each time I thought about it, a deep, bone-chilling cold seeped into me. The forest that once had been my sanctuary, my testing ground for endurance, now filled me with an animalistic dread. I knew I could never again venture into the wilderness so carelessly. The memory of that moose with human eyes would haunt me forever. Every time I imagined picking up my rifle and heading out to hunt, its frozen image flashed before my eyes, and that devilish howl echoed in my ears. Story 2. I was born and raised on the northern coast of Maine. My hometown is small, but the people here are tough, accustomed to the fierce winds and cold Atlantic waters. Since childhood, I loved wandering the beaches in search of interesting shells or sea-smoothed pieces of glass. Over the years, that pastime grew into something more serious. I bought a cheap metal detector and began hunting for rarities. I must admit I hadn't made any big discoveries, mostly rusty fishing hooks, broken clasps, and small coins clearly lost by tourists. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that one day I might find something truly valuable. This morning the weather was far from pleasant. A gloomy sky, a biting wind off the sea, and it looked like rain was imminent. But I decided not to miss the chance. On days like these, deserted beaches are less crowded, and you can work with your detector in peace. I chose one of the most remote stretches of the coast, a place rarely trodden by tourists. Locals call it Forgotten Shore because of its isolation and the wild tides that constantly shift the sand and pebbles. For a treasure hunter, that meant a good chance of uncovering something that had long been securely buried under the earth. I drove there in my old SUV, otherwise there'd be no way to reach such beaches. As soon as I got out of the car, I was enveloped by the smell of salty air mixed with the scent of rotting seaweed. The sea roared, gray waves crashing onto the shore, and sometimes bits of seaweed or splintered wood were carried to my feet. I set up my detector, put on my headphones, and walked along the water's edge. The wind picked up, but I continued to study every signal. Most of the responses were weak, just trash corroded by time. A couple of times I dug up old bottle caps, bent can rings, and other such trinkets. Yet something urged me not to give up. Perhaps it was that long-held dream, to find an ancient coin or a piece of jewelry that held genuine historical value. The murky clouds gathered thicker, and the sea became rougher than usual. I was already considering calling off the fruitless search when I heard a distinct clear signal in my headphones. It was unlike the previous ones, a cleaner sound, as if something heavy and metallic lay beneath the sand. I grabbed my trowel and began carefully digging through the wet sand. My heart pounded in my chest as I worked quickly before another wave could wash over the spot. At one point, I felt my trowel catch on something hard. Brushing away the remaining sand with my hand, I saw what made me literally freeze in place, a gold coin. At first glance, it was small in diameter but felt substantial. Its surface was covered with strange symbols, as if it were imprinted with figures of unknown creatures or perhaps the crest of an ancient family. I couldn't quite decipher what was depicted, but the coin's condition was remarkably good, as if the gold had never been touched by corrosion. I held the find against my palm and felt its pleasant heft. Instantly, thoughts of pirate treasure, of old ships wrecked on rocky shoals, and smugglers hiding gold along this coast filled my mind. Excitement flared within me. It felt as though I had touched something extraordinary and forbidden. I took a deep breath, gazing out at the churning sea and feeling the wind pierce my jacket. I was convinced that this deserted shore hid an entire treasure. Even if a hurricane were to strike, I wouldn't leave without trying to find at least a few more coins. And indeed, a storm was approaching. The sky darkened, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the humid air became charged with electricity. The waves grew higher, and it was clear that the tide was about to rise. But I couldn't stop. The surge of excitement overpowered all rational warnings. I decided to walk once more along the water's edge with my detector, not wanting to miss any additional signals. Something inside whispered that if I left now, I'd never forgive myself. The coin in my pocket tugged at the fabric, as if reminding me that it was merely the tip of the iceberg, and perhaps there lay a whole scattering beneath my feet. I continued along the beach, mesmerized by the storm clouds with their gloomy beauty. I felt the eerie allure of this place. And yet, when the first drops of cold rain lashed my face, a troubling thought crept in. Sometimes the chase for a dream can lead to terrible consequences. But my stubbornness won out, and I pressed on, anticipating new discoveries. I couldn't wait to learn what other secrets this deserted shore held. I clutched the gold coin in my hand when a loud thunderclap struck my ears, and the sea wind suddenly turned ferocious. The tide began rising rapidly, and with it, an increasing anxiety. The water was creeping up to my feet, swallowing the sandy shore. I should have returned to my car, but the mysterious design on the coin wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't leave without spending a little more time searching. When I imagined what might be hidden in the depths of this beach, my heart pounded with adrenaline. I began moving along the shore, listening intently for any signals from my detector. The storm clouds nearly blanketed the sky, and occasional flashes of lightning revealed brief glints in the distance. The sea wind hurled cold raindrops against my face, but I pressed on determinedly. The beach here was uneven. Here and there, stones encrusted with seaweed jutted out, and beyond lay a band of cliffs, areas where people rarely dared to tread, since in winter these rocks froze over, and in summer slick seaweed could easily drag an unwary traveler into the water. I managed to pick up another faint signal, but when I began digging, I found nothing of interest, a simple piece of rust, perhaps from an old chain. I was about to give up when the detector beeped again. This time the sound was clearer, albeit a bit muddled by the crashing waves. I looked up and noticed something glimmering in the distance at the very base of the cliffs. It sparkled as if it were reflecting sunlight, even though the day was shrouded in a uniform gray gloom. Curiosity gripped me, and I moved toward that spot. I had to traverse slippery stones where the water had already reached my knees. I tread carefully to avoid a fall. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. Each crashing wave threatened to knock me off balance. I used one hand for support while clutching my detector with the other, ensuring it wouldn't be swept away by the water. As I neared the cliffs, the waves grew higher. One wave struck so forcefully that I nearly fell, banging my side hard against a sharp stone. The sudden pain in my leg was intense, but I gritted my teeth and continued on. On a narrow strip of the shore, I finally spotted a half-open cave entrance. Previously, it must have been hidden by the tide. Thin streams of water trickled down its walls, and inside lay darkness. Deep within, something glimmered again, sending a strange shiver down my spine. Was it a glint of metal or merely a play of light from my flashlight? I pulled out the small handheld light I always carried for such occasions and shone it into the darkness. The beam slid over the damp walls, revealing a cave floor that sloped downward. A mix of excitement and fear overwhelmed me. The cave might be unstable, and it would be all too easy to get trapped, especially if the water level rose. But turning back no longer seemed like an option. Waves had built up in the passage between the stones, and returning would mean risking another run-in with the surf. The weather worsened steadily, and the air was heavy with a sense of impending danger. I decided that the cave, dubious as it might be, would serve as shelter from the storm. Once inside, I immediately felt a bone-chilling cold. The wind died down, but raindrops now pounded on the rocky vault far behind me. I set my detector on the floor, checked my flashlight, and took several cautious steps deeper into the cave. I proceeded slowly, almost creeping. The atmosphere was oppressively humid and suffocating. Every footstep echoed, and each time I flinched, I thought I heard someone else. I tried to convince myself it was just the acoustics, but something persistently told me I wasn't alone. About 15 steps from the entrance, the floor began to rise, and the ceiling widened into a small chamber. I was startled to see strange streaks running down the walls, as if they had once been covered in murals. I shone my flashlight closer and could make out figures, marred by mold and cracks. They seemed to depict people or animals, though the outlines were distorted and odd. I inhaled a musty scent, a mix of seaweed, old silt, and something else that was hard to pinpoint but deeply unpleasant. Then something metallic caught my eye again. On the damp cave floor lay another gold coin, lightly dusted with sand. It bore the same pattern as the first one. My heart fluttered with anticipation. If this wasn't a coincidence, then these coins might lead to a treasure that had been hidden for decades. Yet, I couldn't shake the gloomy feeling that the cave itself was watching me. As I held the coin closer to my eyes, a sound came from the left, a noise like claws scratching against stone. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the walls, but I saw nothing, only strange, dancing shadows on the uneven surface. Fear gripped me. The tide was already closing in, and the storm was at its peak. Exiting the cave was dangerous. It might wash me out to sea. Moreover, an unsettling thought gnawed at me. The mystery of these coins was far deeper than a mere treasure hunter's luck. I decided to stay in the cave, at least until the storm subsided a bit. Still, I sensed that I would have to escape not only the raging surf, but something far more sinister lurking in the darkness. I took another hesitant step deeper and heard, from somewhere in the distance, a sound resembling a beast's roar. My heart leapt into my throat. I realized I was in for a night I would never forget. I stood at the edge of an underground hall, accessible through a narrow fissure. The storm raged overhead, yet here beneath the rocky layers, it was dry apart from the occasional trickle down the walls. I cranked my flashlight to full brightness and ventured further. Every step echoed loudly, and the sound of the surf faded into the distance. It felt as if I were luring myself into a trap. But my curiosity and passion for treasure drove me onward. Soon the ceiling began to narrow, forcing me to move sideways to avoid brushing the damp walls. Amid the whistling wind and echoes of the surf, I suddenly heard a new sound, a scraping, like a metal chain being dragged over stone. I froze, listened, and shone my flashlight around, but all I found was an eerie emptiness. Perhaps it was just the wind blowing through narrow cracks. I tried to stay calm and concentrate on each step. After wandering through the twisting corridor for several minutes, I emerged into a more spacious chamber. Here, the ceiling was higher and the air a bit warmer. My flashlight revealed strange drawings on the walls, ancient symbols, some overgrown with mold. Drawing closer, I saw crudely drawn figures, people in ritualistic poses, animals I couldn't quite identify, and monstrous shapes resembling wolf-like creatures. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed that these beings had human arms or legs, or at least that's how they were depicted. A thought flashed in my mind. Where did these images come from? Though I didn't say it aloud. It was chilling to realize that someone had once lived here, or at least visited often enough to leave these drawings. Suddenly, my beam skidded across the floor and I noticed yet another gold coin. The same minting, the same mysterious crest. I picked it up as quietly as I could, feeling my palm begin to sweat from the shiver that ran through me. In my short career as a treasure hunter, I had never found anything like this, and now I held two antique coins, each evoking both awe and dread. I began to think about how to get out, but I knew the storm was still raging. On the other hand, staying put was akin to suicide. Then, at the far end of the stone hall, a shadow flickered, and it felt as if my very soul had been snatched away. Squinting, I made out something resembling a human figure, but with a hunched back and an elongated head. It froze for a moment in the beam of my flashlight before vanishing behind a rocky overhang. I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart, convincing myself it was just a hallucination or a trick of the light. But moments later in the darkness, I heard a heavy, labored breath, as if from the maw of a huge beast. Adrenaline pounded in my temples. I wanted to drop the flashlight and run, yet panic is a poor advisor. I slowly took a few steps back and cautiously moved to the side, searching for a narrower exit. But the creature, or whatever it was, had not disappeared completely. It now moved parallel to me, and I could hear its claws scraping against the stone. When it appeared again in the beam of light, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. Before me stood something reminiscent of a wolf on its hind legs, thick gray fur, a twisted snout, long fangs. But its eyes, they held a malicious, almost human-like intelligence. Our eyes met, and I instantly realized this creature was far more dangerous than any ordinary wild animal. It lunged at me so quickly that I had no time to retreat. It struck with its paw so forcefully that I was slammed against the wall. Its claws slashed along my side, and I could feel blood seeping through my jacket. I screamed in pain and terror. This was no ordinary wolf. It was more like a man-wolf, a werewolf, a nightmare creature I'd never imagined even in my wildest dreams. The monster attacked again, this time aiming for my leg, but somehow I managed to roll away and hit its snout with the flashlight. The beast recoiled with a roar, and I seized that moment to try to slip into a side passage. The pain in my side was maddening. Blood clung to my clothes, yet fear fueled my strength. I crawled, clinging desperately to the walls to keep from falling. The creature gave chase with a menacing growl, and I realized my chances of escape were slim. If I didn't run now, I'd be trapped in that cave forever. I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding wildly, with nothing but utter darkness ahead. I no longer remember exactly how I managed to break free from that monster. Perhaps panic made me act faster than usual. When I dashed into a narrow corridor, the creature crashed into a stone wall, apparently misjudging the distance. A dull thud and a furious roar signaled that I had a few precious seconds to slip further down the tunnel. Still, the creature persisted. Its growls and the sound of its heavy footsteps made the walls tremble. My flashlight shattered in the melee, plunging me almost into complete darkness, with only occasional glimmers of light from above, perhaps cracks leading to the surface, or exits where water seeped in during high tide. Navigating by touch was agonizing. The leg I relied on throbbed unbearably, as if I had dislocated or even broken my ankle. My side pulsed from the deep gashes left by the creature's claws. I tried to hold back a cry of pain, but every step came in a spasm. The exit, if it existed, might be nearby, while a deadly monster relentlessly pursued me. The tunnel grew narrower, and at one point I had to crawl on my stomach, squeezing between sharp ledges of rock. The cold, damp stone clung to my palms, while dirt and debris scraped at my chest and stomach. I moved extremely slowly, though I could hear the creature behind me also slowing down, its heavy breathing and guttural sounds growing louder. I imagined that any moment it might squeeze through to grab my legs and drag me back. After several torturous minutes, I suddenly saw a faint grayish light ahead, filtering down from the cave's ceiling. Fueled by desperate hope, I quickened my pace, nearly barreling through the narrow passage. The outlines of rocks became visible, and high above, there was a gap through which, by all appearances, daylight streamed in. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Perhaps it was still morning, or maybe already noon. The storm was likely still raging, but that feeble beam was a symbol of salvation to me. Finally, the corridor opened up, and I managed to come to my knees. The pain in my leg was excruciating, but I forced myself to move forward. The creature was closing in. Its guttural roars and the clacking of jaws confirmed that the cave was its element. I could only hope that an exit truly existed. When I stood up and clutched a stone ledge, raindrops began to fall from above. I felt them on my palms and saw them splashing at my feet in tiny bursts. Summoning my last reserves of strength, I began to climb. It was difficult. My legs buckled and my left ankle barely held, but the fear and the will to survive drove me onward. I slipped on the wet stones, repeatedly scraping my hands until they bled. At one point, I lost my footing and nearly fell, but managed to catch myself with my elbow on a crack in the rock. Then from below, a fierce, angry roar made my heart clench. It was clear the creature was catching up. On the brink of unconsciousness, I finally emerged outside and collapsed onto the ground under a torrential downpour. The sea roared somewhere below, and the wind whipped my face so violently I couldn't even see the horizon. I felt someone grab my shoulder and help me up. Through the curtain of rain, I made out a man in a ranger's uniform. Later, I learned his name was Jack Madison. His face was etched with concern, and he tried to speak to me, though the wind and crashing waves drowned out his words. I tried to turn around, expecting that the cave's entrance would soon reveal the beast's face. But there was nothing. It's as if the creature had been too afraid or unable to come into the light. Perhaps it feared people, weapons, or something else. I lost my balance, and the ranger caught me just in time. My vision blurred. I felt blood running through my clothes, and my body weakened from pain and exhaustion. The last thing I remember is the weary face of the ranger leaning over me in clear horror. Then my consciousness faded as if someone had switched off the lights. When I came to, everything was white and silent. I didn't immediately realize I was in a hospital room until I noticed the typical paraphernalia: a drip, a blood pressure monitor, white walls, and the smell of disinfectant. My head buzzed, my throat was parched, and my body felt as if it were made of stone. I tried to move my legs and felt a sharp pain. My left leg was bandaged and immobilized, and there was also a bandage over my ribs. Apparently, I had been badly injured. Fragments of memories returned: that eerie cave, the strange drawings, the glimmer of gold coins, the wolf-like monster lunging at me from the darkness. I squinted, trying to determine how real it had all been. But the sharp pain in my side reminded me that the attack wasn't a dream. Fully regaining consciousness, I noticed a glass of water and a call button for the nurse on the bedside table. My hand was weak and trembling, but I managed a few sips. The water felt unnaturally cold, yet refreshing after all I'd endured. Later, a doctor and a police officer came in. I could only speak a little. I lacked the strength, and they didn't really believe my account. When I mentioned the wolf-like creature, the doctor shook his head in a restrained manner, and the officer gave me a strange look, clearly thinking I was either more injured than it seemed, or fabricating a tale. Officially, they told me that, judging by the tracks, I had been attacked by a large wild animal, possibly a wolf that had wandered over from the mainland, or, as they suggested, a wild dog. But I knew it wasn't just an animal. They said my ankle had been saved from amputation, but I'd have to forgo walking normally for several months. Crutches and long rehabilitation lay ahead. As for the bites and scratches on my side, the doctors found nothing unusual aside from the depth of the wounds. I tried to explain that the beast was unnatural, but I was advised to rest and let my fantasies lie. The police, too, seemed to drop the subject. No other evidence was found in that area, as the waves and rocks had erased any traces. The next day, I got back my personal belongings. The hospital issued clothes, my phone, which had died by then, my wallet, and the gold coin. It turned out I had managed to hide one coin in the inner pocket of my jacket. The very ranger who found me saw it and turned it over to the police as evidence. But the examination led nowhere. The coin looked too old, bearing an unknown crest. It wasn't listed in any archival records, and the officer, sighing, said it was probably just another amateur forgery. I only shrugged skeptically. I felt its weight and saw how clearly the details were embossed. It didn't look like a makeshift craft at all. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital with a host of recommendations and one overriding thought: I needed time to recover from what I'd been through. I returned to my modest home, a small trailer not far from the highway where I kept all my treasure hunting gear. My metal detector, trowels, and coastal maps. I tried to calm myself and convince myself it was best to forget the whole ordeal, yet I couldn't stop thinking about the coins I'd found and the cave that held even more mysteries. When I finally managed to hobble to my front door with my crutches, a cold jolt of terror shot through me. Lying on the doorstep was a gold coin. It glimmered in the dim light of my flashlight, and the pattern on it was achingly familiar. My heart nearly stopped. How had it gotten there? Nothing had been disturbed. No one had broken in. I picked up the coin and felt that same eerie energy as I had on the beach. In that moment, I realized that the creature that had pursued me in the cave had not disappeared. It was either watching me or leaving a sign, a sort of invitation to return. A cold wave ran down my spine. Memories of the ritualistic drawings on the cave walls and those ghastly, monstrous faces flooded back. Could it be that the cave and the coins were connected to some ancient curse? Or was someone deliberately trying to draw me into a dangerous game? I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing. My life would never be the same. Despite the fear, I felt an obsessive determination growing inside me to uncover the truth at any cost, to unravel the mystery of these coins, and to understand what kind of beast had attacked me in those dark tunnels beneath the rocks. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the dead, watchful gaze of the night at my back. I wanted to bolt every lock, close all the windows, and never step outside again. Yet that dreadful spark of curiosity, the very thing that always pushed me to take risks, remained. I knew that if I never returned, I'd be condemned to live in fear and ignorance. But if I dared to go back, I would have to face whoever left that ominous gift on my doorstep. Story 3. I never imagined that I'd discover something in my grandfather's old house that could change my entire worldview. His modest dwelling, located not far from Sacramento, had always struck me as an ordinary rural home with no secrets whatsoever. After the funeral, I had to go through his belongings, and amid a stack of yellowed letters, piles of old newspapers, and ancient tools, I came across a massive chest made of darkened wood. Beneath a jumble of notebooks and faded photographs lay the diary of my great-great-grandfather, Garrison Willis. Up to that point, I only vaguely knew that Garrison was a renowned hunter and tracker. My great-great-grandfather rarely spoke of him, only mentioning that he loved taking risks and would disappear for long stretches in the northern mountains of California. As I opened the fragile pages of the diary, a strange thrill ran through me. In the early entries, he mentioned a government expedition from 1915, a time when California was rapidly developing, and new roads were being forged through wild lands. Garrison described unusual nocturnal sounds in the forest, unseen silhouettes that seemed to follow the group. He wrote of strange, winged creatures that local guides would talk about. Reading those lines, I couldn't tell whether he'd encountered rare birds of prey or something else entirely. Garrison made note of a place where the forest comes alive after sundown, a spot where government maps ended in blank patches. He recorded that he returned from the expedition with a vague feeling, as if someone had been watching him. His descriptions were laced with both fear and curiosity. I felt that this was more than just the fancy of an early 20th century hunter. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as folklore and tall tales, but something inside stirred. If it were mere fiction, why preserve this diary through the generations? I didn't know what lay ahead, but I already understood that this mystery would not let me rest. Back home, I pored over the diary's pages for a long time, trying to reconstruct the timeline of events, hunting terms and references to bizarre tracks, which Garrison compared to a cross between bird claws and tiny human hands, did not fit into any explanation I could muster. I tried to find rational explanations, since paranormal tales had always struck me as mere flights of fancy. Yet day after day, the strange idea haunted me. What if there was a real threat or phenomenon behind my great-great-grandfather's words? Conversations with several local residents only deepened my doubts. People spoke of recent attacks near Redwood National Park, of sightings of absurd avian monsters that no one could ever capture clearly on film. I didn't want to look foolish, but I felt all these stories pointed to the same thing. At some point, I realized that if I didn't venture out myself, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I had missed my chance to uncover the truth. I grabbed an old travel backpack and packed in a knife, a field recorder, a camera, some extra food, and a couple of thermal blankets. I knew that in the California woods, the weather could be deceiving, especially in the north where fog and cool breezes could catch even the most experienced traveler off guard. With my resolve steeled, I set off. Roadside cafes and gas stations passed by, each surrounded by wild nature that gradually gave way to towering trees and drifting mists. A mix of anxiety and excitement warred within me. I understood I was stepping into a mysterious story that might be nothing more than a fable, or perhaps a reality that people preferred to keep silent about. I had to know the truth, even if it turned out to be more horrifying than any legend. When I arrived at Redwood National Park, I was struck by the grandeur of the ancient trees. Giant sequoias soared skyward, making me feel as if I'd entered a realm where time moved differently. Yet, amid that beauty, charred trunks caught my eye, reminders of the recent wildfires that had ravaged California. I recalled news reports about the blazes and couldn't help but wonder, how seriously do we interfere with nature? After checking in at a ranger station and registering my intended route, the on-duty ranger shook his head disapprovingly upon hearing about the backwoods I planned to explore. He mentioned that some trails were closed due to the risk of new fires and increased wildlife activity. I thanked him for the warning, but even then I knew nothing would hold me back. I drove away from the popular trails and set up a small camp among the towering trees, taking care to remain unnoticed. Dusk fell quickly, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth, pine, and something barely discernible, perhaps the aroma of wet moss. Under the glow of my lantern, the forest looked eerily alive. Enormous trunks seemed like shimmering columns, and the wind whistling through the treetops produced an almost mournful howl. While I was preparing a modest dinner from canned goods, an odd sound suddenly sliced through the silence, a noise that was at once reminiscent of a bird's caw and an animal's growl. My heart skipped a beat. The sound repeated several times, fading into the depths of the forest. I felt a primitive fear welling up inside me. That moment became the first confirmation that Garrison's stories were not mere inventions. Sitting in the small circle of light from my campfire, I sensed that the surrounding darkness concealed far more than it appeared at first glance. The next morning, awakened by the first rays of sun, I felt compelled to study Garrison's diary more closely. Sitting by my tent, I once again delved into its faded entries. My great-great-grandfather described encounters with enormous winged creatures that defied classification. He emphasized that their beaks and talons were something between those of hawks and reptiles, and that their movements were remarkably smooth, almost intelligent. It was then that I decided to follow some of the diary's clues. I took my recorder, donned sturdy clothing, and set out on a short walk along a nearby forest trail. As I ventured deeper, I began to notice strange details, shallow scratches on the bark of trees, as if someone had been marking them in a vertical line, and prints in the soft soil that resembled nothing I'd seen before, except perhaps those of a giant bird. But the size of the footprints was staggering, far too large for any species I knew. While I was photographing these tracks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves made me turn around. I quickened my pace and returned to camp, only to discover that someone or something had been rummaging around my tent. On the ground lay a branch into which several feathers had been embedded. They looked so stiff and resilient that they hardly seemed like they belonged to an ordinary bird. I picked up one sample, feeling its weight in my hand. Adrenaline immediately surged. I realized that these mysterious creatures were indeed present. Could they be descendants of the beings my great-great-grandfather had written about? A mix of fear and excitement overwhelmed me. I was haunted by the faint feeling that I was treading in the footsteps of the past, reviving something that most would dismiss as legend. That night I was awakened by a sudden piercing screech. The darkness outside the tent was as thick as ink. I cautiously peeked out and saw a huge shadow darting among the trees, moving in rapid, jerky bursts. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't a solitary creature. Another silhouette flickered behind a bush to the left. My flashlight caught a glimpse of what looked like a sharp beak and a glinting eye, and then came a shrill, ear-piercing cry that nearly deafened me. In a desperate move, I grabbed the bear spray I'd purchased in case I encountered a cougar or a grizzly. One of these avian predators lunged at me with a sudden movement, and I blindly discharged a cloud of spray straight into its snout. The creature recoiled with a piercing, almost serpentine squeal. At that moment, I heard several more unknown creatures moving in the darkness surrounding the camp. Their collective howling chorus drowned out even the sound of the wind rustling through the treetops. My heart pounded wildly, and one thought blazed through my mind. I had to get out of this trap alive. I grabbed my flashlight and backpack and, fighting the rising panic, made my way through the thick underbrush toward my vehicle. The creatures followed at a distance, intermittently emitting threatening cries. It seemed they weren't trying to kill me, but merely warning that I had trespassed on their hunting grounds. For what felt like an eternity, I ran, tripping over tree roots and glancing back in terror. Finally, bursting onto a country road, I slammed the door shut and felt a crushing terror inside. But I was alive, and my mind raced desperately for answers as to why they had spared me. Early the next morning, I made my way to the nearest ranger station to share my findings. To my surprise, I encountered Dr. Grace Carter, a biologist from the local university studying the aftermath of forest fires. She had overheard my anxious conversation with the ranger, and upon learning about the strange feathers and tracks, showed genuine interest. We retreated to her field lab, where we examined the samples under a microscope. At first glance, the feathers appeared to belong to a large bird, but their structure was unlike that of any known species. Stiff, reinforced by bony plates, and bearing anomalous growths. Grace hypothesized that there might be a mutated species of predatory bird arising at the crossroads of ecological disaster and the region's unique genetics. She admitted, however, that the DNA results could be truly sensational. As we pored over the tattered pages of Garrison's diary, Grace mentioned old legends of the native tribes of Northern California. Myths spoke of flying beasts that, according to lore, would come out at night to protect the ancient lands from outsiders. Over time, these legends had turned into local ghost stories, and most people had stopped taking them seriously. Yet the photographs and feathers I'd shown her made Grace wary. We both understood that we had likely stumbled upon direct evidence that the local fauna might be harboring extremely dangerous and little-known forms of life. I felt relieved that I wasn't alone in my quest. Grace was ready to help me get to the bottom of it, and she didn't dismiss the idea that Garrison's diary was more than just a collection of old, tall tales. The following morning, when Ranger Adam Holt joined us, we formed a small but determined team. Holt knew every trail and dangerous spot in the area, and was prepared to take us to places no ordinary tourist ever set foot. We intended to gather evidence of these avian predators, whether by collecting samples, taking photographs, or simply keeping our distance. Armed with maps, flashlights, protective gear, and a modest first aid kit, we ventured deep into the parts of the forest rarely visited even by seasoned rangers. The high canopies of the sequoias shielded us from direct sunlight, creating a dim, almost twilight-like environment. The air was heavy with the scent of resin, and the ground barely dried after recent rains. Deep in the wilderness, we stumbled upon a gigantic nest woven from thick branches and draped in moss. Inside lay 3 large eggs with a grayish-green shell speckled with tiny spots. I immediately recalled Garrison's diary, where he had described a similar scene, except that back then the eggs had been broken. We quickly snapped several photos and took a small sample of the eggshell. Before we could gather our wits, a menacing hissing sound emanated from above. A shadow flitted through the treetops. Holt shouted a warning, and we all froze. A massive, predatory bird with a hooked beak and a watchful gaze was perched on a branch, clearly monitoring our every move. It was soon joined by another, slightly smaller one. We knew we had crossed a dangerous line. After snapping a few hurried photos, we began to retreat slowly, careful not to provoke an attack. However, the creatures let out a loud, alarming cry from afar, forcing us to dash back. Fortunately, this time, no one was hurt. We eventually left the dangerous territory, convinced that the main mystery had been unveiled. Previously unknown predatory birds, strikingly reminiscent of relic reptiles, indeed lived among the giant sequoias and vigilantly guarded their nests. The materials we'd gathered, photographs, feather samples, and fragments of eggshell, served as irrefutable evidence of these creatures' existence. We felt both pride in our discovery and dread about the potential consequences. People are simply not used to sharing territory with something so perilous. On the return journey, we stuck together, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The dense underbrush and towering trees absorbed most sounds, but occasionally eerie rustling reached our ears, a reminder of the presence of those very predatory birds. As dusk approached, the outlines of the trails began to fade. It felt as though the darkness was thickening faster than usual, compelling us to move even more cautiously. Just as we neared the road, Grace pointed out strange tracks on the damp soil. They were larger and deeper than those left by our mysterious feathered foe. We stopped in tense silence, trying to determine what kind of creature could have made such prints. Ranger Holt frowned as he examined them with his flashlight, but couldn't offer any definitive explanation. While the region was home to many predators, these tracks clearly didn't fit any known pattern. We didn't linger, merely taking a few photographs before continuing on. The tension clung to us all the way to our vehicles, as if nature itself was hinting that our forest expedition had only scratched the surface of its secrets. I kept thinking about Garrison's diary, his warnings, and unsaid details. Perhaps deep in the redwood forest there wasn't only a colony of enigmatic predatory birds, but also other creatures we knew nothing about. The mere thought was far more terrifying than any legend or myth.